All right. Well, I guess we're recording now, Shane.
Yep.
All right.
Welcome,
Good.
welcome everybody. It's Shane Fisher, the host. Welcome y'all to another Bible study with us. We are looking at the Dayton Prophecies of Daniel, and this is probably our last video on the text of Daniel. We might deal with looking at some objections next in some other videos, but right now we're going to look at Daniel chapter 11 verses 36 through chapter 12 verse 13. And David has written a book, which we've mentioned every time, called Daniel the Apologetic Prophet. And you can get it from Yeoman Press, and you can reach him by email, as you can see on the screen. And tonight I'm going to be the disciple, and he's going to be the teacher. And I'm going to let him do most of the talking because I've done most of the talking last time. So take it
All
away,
right.
brother.
All right. Well, thank you, Shane, and thank you everybody for anybody who is watching this podcast. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate Shane for doing this. I really have been enjoying this study on the prophecies of Daniel. Okay, we're about to get into Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through the rest of the book, chapters 12 and verse 13. So that's the section we're going to cover tonight, or whenever time you're watching this podcast. Um, Before we get into Daniel 11:36 and following, I kind of want to give us a quick review of where we've been in chapter 11 so you can kind of see how it fits in the context. So in chapter 11, of course, back in chapter 10, Daniel has an interaction with some angels, and they reveal to him the future of Israel. And so chapter 11 begins the prophecy that the angels start to reveal to Daniel. So the first four verses of Daniel 11 talk about basically the rise of Alexander the Great and the transition of the Persian kingdom to the Greek kingdom. So that's the first four verses. Verses 5 through 20 discuss basically the Seleucids and Ptolemies. So if you recall, Alexander the Great's kingdom was divided into four parts after his untimely death. His four generals were in charge of those four divisions. And two of those divisions are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The Seleucids in this chapter are called the kings of the north. That's the area around Syria, north of Jerusalem. And then the Ptolemies is the area of Egypt, south of Jerusalem. And so that's Daniel 11, 5 through 20. And that is really kind of a neat section of scripture because it's so intricate, and it's kind of like Jerusalem is caught in between these two kingdoms, the Seleucids and Ptolemies, and they're basically kicking Jerusalem around like a hockey puck or maybe even a football. And so it's a really interesting section of the prophecy, very intricate and very specific. So that's verses 5 through 20. And verses 21 through 35, and this is what we talked about last time, and I thought Shane did a great job in discussing the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes. He was also prophesied by Daniel in chapter 8, and he plays a key role in the history of the Jews. The celebration of Hanukkah originated because of the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean revolt, and how they were able to revolt against Antiochus. And so Daniel just prophesies the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, as well as Antiochus's desecration of Jerusalem. That's from verses 21 through 35. The section we're going to be looking at is Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through the rest of this chapter and on into chapter 12. And in my view, I think this is talking about the Roman-Jewish War and the destruction of Jerusalem, and that of course, took place in AD 67 through AD 70. Jesus, of course, was crucified in around AD 30, and then about 40 years later, Jerusalem was destroyed. And when we were discussing the prophecy of the 70 weeks, that prophecy deals primarily with Jesus, his death upon the cross in 30 AD, and then the destruction of Jerusalem that occurred in 70 AD. And so Daniel is going to elaborate basically on that prophecy that he gave in chapter 9. He's going to elaborate on that prophecy in verses 36 through the end of this chapter and on into chapter 12. And so that's my interpretation of it, and I'm going to show you why I believe that's the case as we go through this prophecy.
Yeah, we
All
want to
right.
admit. I think we should admit up front this is a very difficult portion of Scripture, and there are different views on this. To be honest, I'm not committed to this view as of yet. I'm still studying it, but we want David to present his view. We do know it's not talking about the Antichrist. I guess we could talk about what's not talking about.
Yes, yes,
It's
yes.
easier.
I am not a premillennialist, and nowhere does the word Antichrist appear in the Bible, except when it's talking about many Antichrists, not one specific Antichrist. So,
All right.
no, I do not believe in one single Antichrist figure that's going to show up at the second coming of Christ. I think that's a forced interpretation, and even though that's common interpretation among many conservative Bible scholars on this section of Scripture, I don't take that position. But at the same time, I don't take the position of the liberal critics who take these verses to refer to Antiochus. The liberal critics, and not all liberal critics do. I mean, or at least I say not all conservative scholars take the position that I take, as Shane just mentioned. And so there are conservative scholars, and I think Shane is one of them, at least right now he is. Hopefully I'll change his mind. But yeah, there are conservative scholars that will actually agree with the liberal critics and believe that the rest of this chapter is talking about Antiochus. But they just don't uh, follow the interpretation of the liberal critics that Daniel got the death of Antiochus wrong. There's a debate about whether or not verses 36 through the rest of the chapter fit with the known history about Antiochus Epiphanes. And so that's one of the reasons why, number one, why liberal critics date Daniel to the second century, because what they say is, well, Daniel got the prophecies right up until verse 36, so that must be about the time when Daniel started writing, because he was writing after the fact, so he was able to get all those prophecies right because he was writing after the fact. But according to the liberal critics, they'll say from verses 36 through the rest of the chapter, he got Antiochus Epiphanes wrong, his demise.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why they date Daniel to the second century. That's actually the primary reason why they date it to the second century, which I think is an important point that we need to discuss. And sometimes conservatives don't address this issue very well. They just assume that liberal critics are just dumb and they don't believe in prophecy, and so they date it to the second century. Well, that's part of it, but really they do have a point here. There's some question about verses 36 through the rest of the chapter because it doesn't seem to fit what we know about Antiochus Epiphanes from what we know about known history. But at any rate, in my view, I don't think it refers to Antiochus, and I'm about to prove. I think I can prove it, and so to me, that whole debate is neither here nor there because Daniel is not talking about Antiochus, as we shall see. All right, so let's get started here. We're in Daniel 11, verse 35. This is the transition verse. So from 21 to 35, like I said, this is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and his desecration of Jerusalem. And this section ends with this verse. It says, "And some of the wise shall stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time." So here's a question for you. What does the time of the end mean here in this verse? Is it future? And how far into the future is it? And so if the time of the end in this verse is contemporary with Antiochus, then it would make sense that verses 36, talking about the king there in verse 36, the self-exalted king, it would make sense that that would be Antiochus. But um, if the time of the end in this verse is not referring to Antiochus, if Daniel is skipping ahead into the future beyond Antiochus, then we don't really have to assume that the king in the next verse is Antiochus Epiphanes because he's transitioning to a future time period. I'd like to point out here that it's not unusual for Daniel to skip over large periods of time in this prophecy. In verses 2 and 3, I don't have those verses, but I guess I can pull them up on my eSword here. Let me go ahead and pull that up. Can you see that, Shane?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so here's eSword. I think I have it in the King James. I'm just going to put it in the ESV because I usually like to use that one unless I don't agree with the ESV in a certain place. But let's see. So if you look at verses
Mm-hmm.
2 and 3, we have these Persian kings mentioned here. And then the fourth Persian king becomes strong through his riches.
Xerxes.
And, yeah, that's Xerxes, right? He shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. And then in verse 3, it then transitions to a mighty king. Well, who is this mighty king again?
Alexander.
So that's Alexander. Well, how much time is there between verse 2 and verse 3?
About 100 something years.
So Alexander the Great is not contemporary with Xerxes, is he?
Mm-mm.
He's not a contemporary. If you were just reading Daniel along here and you didn't know the background history of Xerxes and Alexander the Great, you might think this mighty king is contemporary with the fourth king here, the fourth Persian king, wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
The only reason why we know that this is not contemporary is why? Because of the fulfillment.
Yeah.
So keep in mind, it is not unusual for Daniel to skip from one period of time to another period of time that's not contemporary in one verse without even letting us know. So that's one point. So if that's the case in verses 2 and 3, then we shouldn't necessarily assume that the king in verse 36 is identical to Antiochus. I think most naturally it does look like it is, but at the very least, we shouldn't automatically say, well, it has to be Antiochus. Well, no. Just like the king in verse 3 didn't have to be contemporary with Xerxes. And so that's one point. But if you look, Daniel actually tells us that there's a transition. What does he say here? Until the time of the end, right? In verse 35. Until the time of the end. So let me go back to my PowerPoint here. So here, Daniel is marking a transition. Question, is this time of the end in the future? For it still awaits the appointed time. Sounds like it's future to me, right? How far into the future? Well, Daniel doesn't say. So should I assume it's contemporary, or is it reasonable to say that it could be an extended period of time? We don't know. Daniel doesn't say. So we need to look further into the context to determine that. But the point I'm making here is we don't know how far into the future this time of the end is. It may include Antiochus, but it may not. Okay? All right, so go back to Daniel chapter 8, verse 19. We know this is talking about Antiochus. Even liberal critics admit it. This phrase, appointed time of the end, was applied to Antiochus Epiphanes and God using him to judge Israel. Okay, that's why it's called the appointed time of the end. It's not the second coming judgment, but it's God's judgment using Antiochus to judge the Jews. Okay, that's chapter 8. So there's one time of the end that we know refers to Antiochus. All right? If you go to Daniel chapter 9, this is the famous 70 weeks prophecy, which most conservative scholars, and I know Shane takes it to be referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, right? So notice we have an end made reference to here in verse 20, in verse 26 and 27. Desolations are decreed; its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. So we have a decreed end, right? So we have a decreed end made reference to here. So there's another time of the end mentioned. One talking about Antiochus in chapter 8, and a decreed end, a time period of another end period in chapter 9. This is the Roman period, or 70 AD, 67 through 70 AD. All right, so let's go back to chapter 11. I know this is complicated, guys. Sometimes there's just no easy way of doing it but to dive in, get our feet wet, and dive into the deep end here. And so you guys, if you want a copy of this PowerPoint, I'm sure you can contact me or Shane, and we can get this PowerPoint to you, or you can watch this video over and over again to get what I'm saying here. All right, so back to chapter 11. Daniel 11, verse 27. Notice this is talking about Antiochus, right? for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. In verse 29, when does this end period start? Verse 29, right? At the time appointed, Antiochus shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. So what happens during this appointed time of the end? Verse 31, forces from Antiochus shall appear and profane the temple, take away the regular burnt offering, and there you have the abomination of that makes desolate. So we know the time of the end in verse 27 begins in verse 29, and it goes through verse 31, talking about Antiochus Epiphanes and the judgment that God uses Antiochus to judge his people, right? There's a desecration of Jerusalem here. So that's one time of the end. And I would argue that this is the time of the end in chapter 8, talking about Antiochus, right? Okay? But if we go to verse 35, this can't be the same time of the end that we just saw. Why? Because what does it say? For it still awaits what? The appointed time. So this is a future time of the end, not necessarily related to Antiochus Epiphanes or what happened in verses 27 through 31. So we have two time of the ends here. So it seems to me that it is at least possible that this time of the end does not include Antiochus. It may, but it may not. Well, let's keep on reading. In verse 36, here we have the self-exalted king. It says, and the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. Notice, for what is decreed shall be done. Where have we seen this phrase before? Daniel chapter 9, verses 27. The Hebrew word for decreed in verse 36 of Daniel 11 is the same Hebrew word for decreed in verse 27 of Daniel 9. And according to Jason Thomas Perry, it is a rare Hebrew verb that doesn't occur very often in the Hebrew Old Testament, but Daniel uses it twice, I think, in Daniel 9 and Daniel 11:36. So this, I think, gives us some degree of confidence that the time of the end here is talking about what? Daniel 9, verse 27, and the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? Are you following me?
Yeah, I'm following you.
Okay, good. Just making sure. So I think this gives us a good reason to believe the time of the end in verse 35 is the decreed end in Daniel 9, 26 and 27.
Is there any way to point out what Hebrew word that is? Is that in the
yes,
article?
I'll pull it up on my eSword here.
Just to let those.
Let me see what it says. All right, so King James has the word determined instead of decreed. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So there's that Hebrew word there. Looks like it's karatz or karatz.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a good Hebrew scholar, but there it is. There's the Hebrew word in Daniel 11:36. So let's go to Daniel 9.
Mm-hmm.
There's the word determined. What's that Hebrew word?
Karatz.
Karatz. So we have the determined, or as the ESV says, the decreed, determined or decreed end. Okay? So I think we have pretty good, at least a strong presumption that the time of the end in verse 35 here, until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time, it's future, and I think it's the most plausible interpretation is that this decreed time of the end refers back to what? Destruction of Jerusalem, right? In 70 AD. That 67 to 70. So I think we have a pretty good case so far that that's what this is referring to. So now let's see if the details of the prophecy fit with what we know about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 67 through 70. And if the details fit that prophecy, then I think we have absolutely no reason to think that this is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, because we have no reason to assume it's unprovable that the time of the end here includes Antiochus. It may or it may not. So if the details do not fit Antiochus, and they do fit the destruction of Jerusalem, and we have good reason to believe that this is referring back to Daniel 9, then I believe this prophecy is talking about that. So let's take a look at the prophecy. All right. So, and let me pull up my PowerPoint. There we go.
Want me to read? Or
Go ahead and, if you would, Shane, read verse 35 and read through verse 36, and then we'll talk about that.
And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, made white, till the time of the end, for it still waits the appointed time. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. Okay,
so as Shane read, notice we have until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time, so it's future. I just argued that it's referring to the Roman Empire, AD 67 through 70. Okay? So now we have the king. So I believe the king here is from what time period? From the time of the end, right? The nearest antecedent is actually not Antiochus. The nearest antecedent is this time period, until the time of the end. So this is a king that's at the time of the end. And when we get to verse 40, that's proven pretty much beyond doubt. Okay? So we have the king at the time of the end. So we're skipping ahead beyond Antiochus, 280, 67 through 70. So we have a king here who exalts himself, magnifies himself above every god, which is not, there's nothing unusual about this. God's enemies, kings that are enemies of God, this is what they do, right? So there's nothing unusual about this as far as being special to any king so far. So he exalts himself, magnifies himself above every god. He speaks astonishing things against the God of gods. Who's the God of gods?
Well, God of Israel.
Yeah, Yahweh.
God
right?
Yahweh.
So he speaks astonishing things against Yahweh. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. This phrase, this indignation, this was applied to Antiochus in Daniel 8, but I've already argued that this is not talking about Antiochus. But that doesn't necessarily mean it has to talk about Antiochus, because the self-exalted king was the same language as applied to Alexander the Great earlier in the chapter. So Daniel's using some language here that overlaps different types of people. So we shouldn't think anything strange about that. But the indignation refers to God's judgment against Israel until the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. That was referred back to Daniel 9, 26 and 27. All right, so nothing unusual about any of this. This is some king at the time of the end. All right, I'm thinking at this point it could be a Roman king, right? Maybe it's a Roman king. Let's see. Shane, read verse 37.
He shall pay no attention to the gods or God of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women, or desire of women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all.
All right, so we learned some more about this king. This king, he's not going to pay attention to, it says the ESV here says the gods of his fathers. So they interpret this king as having a pagan god, being a pagan, right? By all accounts, it looks like he's a pagan. But the plural form of gods in Hebrew is also, like, it's Elohim, right? And so it could be referring to who?
It could be referring to the true God.
It could be referring to Yahweh, God of his fathers, and the King James actually translates it with a big G. So both translations are possible. The question is, which one is right?
Okay? Yeah.
If this if this is referring to Yahweh, then it's possible that this king could be a Jewish king, right? He shall pay no attention to the God of his fathers. I mean, we wouldn't expect a pagan king to pay attention to Yahweh. Plus, it says of his fathers. Well, Yahweh is not the God of the ancestors of Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, So, if this is referring to Yahweh, then what do we know about this self-exalted king?
Yeah,
Is he a
and
pagan?
just another point.
Yeah,
Well, maybe bring in regards to Antiochus Epiphanes, who he appealed to Zeus.
yeah,
So that doesn't seem to make sense that if it's the description of him, because he did in a sense pay attention to Zeus because he set him up in the Jerusalem temple.
yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, if this, I mean, it's not entirely impossible that this could be referring to Antiochus. I think you could argue that maybe, but I'm going to argue it's not because I believe the proper translation should be God of his fathers, which would make the king
Jewish. I
Jewish.
mean, it's got to be
It would have to be because only a Jew, only Yahweh is the
the
God
true
of
God.
his ancestors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, so here, this is interesting to me. This is what Jason Perry said in his article. Let me go ahead and try to pull it up because I think he says it better than I do. Let me see if I can find where he says it. Can you see that article?
Yeah, I'll tell you when to zoom in a little bit.
Let's see.
Keep going.
Here we are. Okay, it's on this page here.
A little bit up.
Okay, so he says here the king of 1136 through 39
Can
is
you
not.
can you go in a little bit
Zoom in?
zoom in
Yeah.
just for the audience sake?
Yep. Can y'all see that?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so
Okay.
here's what he says here. He says the king, the phrase God of one's fathers, he says it occurs 60 times in the Masoretic text or the basic Hebrew text of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
It occurs 60 times and always refers to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, unless this is the one exception.
Go down to footnote
So here's
34 if you don't mind.
yeah. So here's his footnotes. Look at all this. So every time you see the phrase, that Hebrew phrase, God of one's fathers, it's
Mm-hmm.
always referring to Yahweh, unless this verse is the one exception. So is it possible that this is an exception? Yeah, but it seems to me that the evidence leans more towards it not being an exception, because that's not the way a Jew would use that phrase, God of his fathers, the Hebrew expression. So, and this is what he says here. He says young, although he applies the passage to the Antichrist, he
Which
still
we've
didn't.
already said.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not impossible.
Then he says Steinman. He says rightly recognizes that the phrase refers to Yahweh, but denies that the king will necessarily be Jewish because this phrase is not an ethnic identification but a religious one. And then he goes, this distinction is questionable in the Old Testament context, and Daniel would have understood the phrase to be used with respect to a descendant of the fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So I think he makes a good point here. And plus, as we shall see, this king is distinguished between the kings of the north and south. So, which would seem to indicate that this would be what the king of who? Jerusalem, right? So I think he makes a pretty good case here that the king is Jewish, and I see no reason to think otherwise, really. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. All right, so this king, he's a Jewish king. It says he shall pay no attention to the God of his fathers, that's Yahweh, or to the one beloved by women. This could also be translated, or to the desire of women. So if this desire of women is referring to another God, it's possible that this could be a reference to the Messiah. The women, and they long to be the mother of the Messiah. So this could be a subtle reference to the Messiah, or in my view, it just means that this king is not going to he's going to have he's not going to consider women. Basically, he's going to have an inappropriate desire for women as a possibility here, and this is interesting to me. Let me see here. I don't know why I zoomed out of that. Let me go back. But I've got it up here. Yeah, here it is. Okay. All right. So, in my view, I think this king here is referring to this guy here, John of Giscala. And during the Roman-Jewish War, John of Giscala was one of the three Jewish factions that were fighting over control over the Jerusalem temple during the war in 67 through 70. And here, Josephus, the Jewish historian, who, by the way, was captured during the Roman-Jewish War, and he actually documented for Vespasian and Titus. He actually documents what happens during that war, and this is what he had to say about this guy. John.
That's where he's from, right?
Yeah, he's from Giscala. I think that's somewhere in Galilee, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's from Galilee.
You want me to read it since you do?
Well,
or you want me to? You can just tell me to stop.
Let's see. So here, notice he makes reference to John. I've got it highlighted. And notice it says, what does it say right here, Shane? He was.
Can you highlight it? Or just curiosity. He was evidently laying claim. Oh. You go back.
There you go. Yeah.
He was evidently laying claim to absolute sovereignty.
And notice the Greek word there for sovereignty. What do you
Monarchia.
see there?
I think I know the
English word
that comes from that. Monarchy.
Yeah, a monarchy here. So, and then if you skip on down, do you see where it says "on the other hand"?
He was abandoned by a large section of antagonists, partly influenced by envy. They scorned subjection to a former equal, but mainly deterred by dread of monarchical rule.
Okay, why? Because they could not expect easily to depose him when once in power. And so what was John trying to do? Make himself what?
King.
So he was a self-exalted king, right? You might say he was a self-exalted king. So that's from Josephus, and there's the reference there if anybody wants to look that up. It also says that this king is going to speak astonishing things against the God of gods. This happened concerning the temple sacrifices. Shane, can you read like the highlighted part there?
Mm-hmm. For the Roman sovereigns ever honored.
Well, just say this Jew.
Whereas this Jew now pulled down even the donations of foreigners, remarking to his companions that they should not scruple to employ divine things on the divinity's behalf, and that those who fought for the temple should be supported by it. He accordingly drew every drop of the sacred wine and of the oil, which the priests kept for pouring upon the burnt offerings, and which stood in the inner temple, and distributed these to his horde, who without horror anointed themselves and drank therefrom.
So this guy here, Josephus even, if you keep on reading, what does it say there at the end? It says, I'll go ahead and read this. It says, "Nor can I here refrain from uttering that what my emotion bids me say." He says, "I believe that had the Romans delayed to punish these reprobates, either the earth would have opened and swallowed up the city, or it would have been swept away by a flood," which, by the way, is what Daniel described, right? And we're going to see that in a minute. It would have been swept away by.
That's funny. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, swept away by a flood, or have tasted anew the thunderbolts of the land of Sodom. So, this guy, he spoke astonishing things against the God of gods. Notice he remarked to his companions that basically we're going to use the sacred wine for ourselves. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, to any pious Jew, this guy would be considered speaking as being somebody who's speaking astonishing things against the God of gods. Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's go on to the next section. Okay, so we have the desire of women. Mm-hmm. This is from Josephus documents what he did when he was fleeing Galilee to go to Jerusalem during Vespasian's campaign against the northern territories there above Jerusalem. like Galilee. John flees Galilee eventually, and he goes towards Jerusalem. But this is what they do on the way. Shane, could you read? It says here that he permitted them
to do all these things that any of them desired to do.
So his people, the people that were associated with John. Keep on reading, please.
While their inclination to plunder was insatiable, as was their zeal in searching the houses of the rich and for the murdering of the men and abusing of the women, it was sport to them.
It was sport to them. So he allowed his men
to take advantage.
He didn't care about the desire of women, did he? And what's interesting, if you keep on reading what they did, look what the next section there. They also devoured what spoils they had taken together with their blood. Notice they indulged themselves in feminine wantonness without any disturbance till they were satiated therewith, while they decked their hair and put on women's garments. So, we think that, in America today, that we're going, we've never seen anything like, what we've seen in America when it comes to homosexuality and transvestitism and all that stuff. Well, no, this is what was going on.
It's not anything new. There's nothing new under the sun.
New. So this could be a reference here to the desire of women. Could be referring to the one desired of women, the Messiah, like a God, the Messiah God of the Old Testament, or he just didn't care about women. He didn't care about Yahweh, nor did he care about women, and so that could be a translation there. So let's go back to the verses here. So he paid no attention to Yahweh. He paid no attention to women, and he did not pay attention to any other god, because he's a self-exalted king. He didn't care about any god, and he didn't care about women. And so he didn't even pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. Verse 38 says, he shall honor the God of fortresses. So what's interesting is here, this word fortresses is the same word used to describe the Jewish temple back in verse 31, I believe. The sanctuary of strength. The word strength there in the King James is also translated fortress or fortresses, I believe, in verse 31. Let me see if I can pull that up.
Yeah, they shall defile the sanctuary fortress.
Yeah, so that same word there is used here in verse 30. Well, it's 38. So he shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. So the God of fortresses can't be a conventional God, because he's not honoring any conventional God up here, right? So this has got to be a God of his own making, basically, right? He's going to honor the God of fortresses. So I take this to be a distorted view of Yahweh. Remember what he said, that our quote about how he used the utensils and the sacred offering, the oil and the wine. We can use it on the divinity's behalf. You remember that phrase? So he appears to have a distorted view of Yahweh. And so basically he has turned Yahweh, the God of the Jewish temple, into his own God, a God of his own making, into a kind of a military God here. Okay. So he shall honor this God, this distorted view of Yahweh, the God of fortresses, instead of, the one true God, the way he is. Okay. He's basically made Yahweh into a God of his own making. A God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and costly gifts. And notice, he shall deal with the strongest fortresses, or the temple, with the help of a foreign God. This is talking about his distorted view of Yahweh.
Does Perry have anything to say?
Yeah, concerning? And so I guess I can pull that up and see how he says. Okay, so the king's God of fortresses. he says here the tension between the statement that the king would not give heed to any god and the statement that the king would honor a god of fortresses suggests that the god of fortresses is not a conventionally recognized deity, but rather an innovation on the part of the king. The king's god of fortresses could represent the king's worship of military power and war, and he quotes Habakkuk 1:11. The king's offerings of gold, silver, and precious stones to the god of fortresses could be figurative for the resources which the king invests in building his military power. Another possibility is that the Jewish king's god of fortresses refers to his distorted conception of Yahweh, which has become the king's idol. The king has... Yeah. So he has invented an idolatrous version of Yahweh who is concerned with fortresses and especially with the perversion or the preservation, of the temple in Jerusalem. Thus, the king honors Yahweh in name, but not in truth, since the real Yahweh has, in fact, determined to destroy the temple, as in Daniel 9:26-27. So I think he makes some good points there. There's a tension there between Yahweh and then this god of fortresses. Apparently it's a kind of a god of his own making, a distorted view of Yahweh. So he seems to be focused more on military power, wants to turn the temple into a military complex, which is basically what he tries to do here in the war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, he definitely sets up as his military camp, so to speak.
Yep. So to me that fits what Daniel's saying here about the self-exalted king. He shall honor this military king, this god of fortresses. So he's turned Yahweh into this idolatrous, a distorted view of Yahweh, who's more concerned about the Jewish temple than he is about the true temple, the church, so to speak. All right, so it says, a God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses, the temple, with the help of this foreign God, his distorted view of Yahweh. Those who acknowledge him, in other words, those who acknowledge his view of Yahweh, this God of military power, then will load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many and shall divide. This I think is interesting. It says here, he shall divide the land for a price. How many factions of Jews were there fighting over the temple? There were actually 3. You had John of Giscala. You had Simon something. I forgot his name now. And then you had Eleazar. So they were fighting with each other over control over Jerusalem, basically. So notice they were all concerned with this military view of Yahweh. And so their military view of Yahweh then would reward them and divide the land for a price. I think that's interesting to me because that's exactly what happened. Vespasian and Titus, they actually stopped the war and let the Jews fight amongst themselves to destroy themselves, which is kind of interesting to me. But anyway, I think that's what that's referring to there. His view of Yahweh as a military god. And so if you view Yahweh as a military god, then in your mind, this military god is going to reward you with military things. He's going to reward you with honor. He's going to reward you. He's going to make you rulers over the many and divide Jerusalem for a price. What was the price? Well, it ended up being their downfall, basically. All right. So,
would you mind hit the present button?
Yes. While you're at it? Sorry.
I forgot to.
Okay, let's see. Let me move this out of the way. My view. Okay. All right. So already talked about that. Yeah. Notice it says he will employ divine things on the divinity's behalf. So here's his distorted view of Yahweh. So basically, he's saying, well, Yahweh, he'll allow us to basically commit sacrilege, religious activities on his behalf, is what he's saying here. So he had a distorted view of Yahweh. All right, now let's get into verse 40. So that was a self-exalted king. So verse 40 is interesting because it kind of sets up the rest of the chapter. It kind of summarizes what's going to happen in the rest of the chapter. And in the Old Testament, sometimes you'll see a verse that will give you a summary, and then the verses that follow explain the summary. And Jason Perry, he makes reference to a lot of different places in the Old Testament where this kind of literary device is used, where you have this summary statement of what's going to happen, and then the verses that follow explain what happens. So that's kind of what's going to happen here in verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north. Actually, King James here uses the word and here. I think and should be better, the better conjunction, not but, because I think both of them together are attacking the king of are attacking the self-exalted king here. So the king of the south and the king of the north shall rush upon him, the self-exalted king, like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. And he shall come into countries, talking about the king of the north, he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. Remember when Josephus said, talking about flooding, uses the flood imagery to describe the destruction. Basically he wanted God to destroy John of Giscala. Well, that's basically what God's going to do. He's going to use Vespasian, the king of the north, to, as a flood, come through and destroy Jerusalem. And so the king of the south here, I've got it highlighted in green. That's the ruler of Egypt at this time, who is Tiberius Julius Alexander. He was appointed by Nero, actually, in 66 as the prefect of Egypt. And Vespasian actually has Tiberius Julius Alexander to help his son Titus destroy Jerusalem. So he plays a role in the destruction of Jerusalem. So we have the king of the south, that was the ruler of Egypt at this time. This guy here, Tiberius Julius Alexander. The king of the north is a king from Syria. Well, Vespasian, he of course becomes the Roman emperor, which would include Syria. But Vespasian also was the commander of the Syrian Legion 10 Fretensis, and the campaign of Vespasian in 67 comes from Syria and comes from the north. So the king of the north here would be Vespasian, who is literally the king of the north, because he's actually the king of everybody. He's basically he is the Roman emperor. He will become the Roman emperor. So that's who I believe is the king of the south and the king of the north. They're attacking the self-exalted king in Jerusalem, and that of course is King John of Giscala. All right.
And once again, we're viewing this from the perspective of Israel, and that this is one's from Egypt, from down south, and the other one's from up north. So it doesn't have to necessarily refer to the Ptolemies and Seleucids.
No, but it's from the same area because the time of the end has skipped ahead into the future. So this would be the king of the counterpart to the king of the north and the counterpart to the king of the south, Syria and Egypt. Okay, so here is the campaign of Vespasian. He shall come into the glorious land. What's the glorious land?
Let me see here. Palestine or Israel.
Yeah, Judea, Jerusalem, right? And tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. I've got a map here that kind of shows this area that I want to pull up here. I guess this, yeah. No, that's the wrong one. Yeah, it's this map here. All right, so let me go back to my PowerPoint so I can make sure we know what we're talking about here.
Edom, Moab, and parts of Ammon.
Yeah, Edom and Moab, I believe, are this area here in the Nabatean kingdom. And according to Jason Thomas Perry, I can scroll down. I have it on I've got what he says here on my PowerPoint. But notice Edom, Moab, and parts of Ammon, they were not annexed by the Romans until what time?
106 AD.
So this is 67 to 70. So Edom, Moab, and parts of Ammon were not a part of the Roman Empire, which is what it says here. Vespasian, he doesn't conquer Edom, Moab, or the main part of the Ammonites. Those weren't annexed by Rome until 106 AD. But parts of Ammon were conquered by Vespasian. That would include Gedora, and I believe that is referring to this area. Oops, that's the wrong map. This area here, Perea. So parts of Ammon would be right here. So he didn't conquer this area here, but he did conquer parts of the Ammonites, Perea, the capital, Gedora and Perea, that area there. Some parts, not all. So this fits perfectly with what Daniel says in the prophecy. This fits with what we know about history, which I think is kind of cool. All right, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. And present.
Yeah.
And I'll skip. Oops.
I don't know if you talked about the first bullet point real quick. That which Vespasian. Oh,
the campaign.
Go back.
So you want to talk about
that Vespasian came from the north in the spring of 67, slaughtered thousands of Jews.
Thank you for letting me know. I forgot about that. Yeah, I skipped it. There's a lot of information here. Right. Thank you, Shane. All right, so let me exit out of my PowerPoint and let me pull up this website here, Josephus.org. Josephus, of course, documented all this, and so on this website, it's based upon what Josephus documented, and so we're going to look at
success of Vespasian.
Vespasian's campaigns here. I believe he had 3 of them.
Keep going.
Yeah, so we have the Galilean campaign.
Can you click on it?
Campaign. I think this has all 3 highlighted here. So let me see here. Yeah. So take a look at this. So we have the red there is in 67. Where these are the areas that he conquered in red in 67. In 68 AD is the blue. So he got around.
Yeah.
All right. So there's Jerusalem right there. Here are the areas surrounding it. There's Pella. Shane, can you tell us about Pella? What do we know about Pella?
Eusebius, who is what we would call the second church historian, he documents that the Christians fled there before the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, so we're going to get into that at a later time, but I think it's interesting that in Pella, the church in Jerusalem, at least, fled to the mountains of Pella. Mount Pella, I think it's the mountains of Pella. Just like Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse, flee to the mountains when you see Jerusalem surrounded. And that's what they did. Early in the war, the Romans surrounded Jerusalem, but for some reason, Cestius Gallus, the Syrian governor, backed away or whatever, and the Jews had time to get out of Jerusalem if they wanted to. And the Christians in Jerusalem did, according to Eusebius, they fled to Pella, the mountains, Mount Pella or whatever. Okay, so in pink here is the campaign in 69. So by that time, he's already where?
He is getting closer and closer to Jerusalem.
Yeah. So in 3 years' time, he's going to destroy a lot of places. But as I pointed out, he does not touch. I keep on pulling up that map. It's this map. He does not touch this area here, and he does not touch all of this area. He only does parts of that area. And if you remember with the campaign, he doesn't touch this area. He only comes down here and there, and parts of it.
And show that again. That campaign map. I think that's just a good. Yeah, that's interesting. Huh.
Okay.
Wow.
So there's Gadara. That would be the area, parts of the Ammonites, but not all of them. So he left this area out here, and he only conquered parts, just like Daniel says in the prophecy, which is kind of cool. Is that a coincidence? I think not. All right, so let's go back to our prophecy.
Present.
Present. Yeah, I keep on forgetting to do that. Present. All right. So we have Edom, Moab, and parts of Ammon. So that's the Nabatean kingdom and parts of Perea, I think. Parts of that area there where Perea was at. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Gedora. The part of Ammon that was conquered by the Vespasian was Gedora. Okay. There we go. It's not letting you move. There we go. There we go. Okay. Verse 42. Shane, can you read that for me?
Mm-hmm. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall, or do you want me to stop? Or he shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train.
All right, so this is kind of cool. So Vespasian's going to stretch out his hand against the countries and the land of, notice, even the land of Egypt shall not escape. Where was Vespasian declared emperor?
In Egypt, wasn't it?
In Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt. And so he becomes the ruler over Egypt because he becomes the Roman emperor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver and all the precious things of Egypt. Why did Vespasian go to Egypt? Well, he went to Egypt to secure the grain supply. And we talked about this before, the importance of why is Egypt important to the Roman Empire?
It's a bread basket.
It's the bread basket. You can't have a military if you don't have food to feed them, basically. And so that's why he secures the grain supply there in Egypt. That's why he goes there. This is before the siege of Jerusalem, by the way. So he becomes the ruler of Egypt in 69 AD, December of AD 69. He becomes the Roman emperor, which includes Egypt. But notice it says what? It says the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. Well, where is the Libyans and Cushites? I'm going to show you another map. This is the map that I kept on bringing up for some reason. Now we'll go to the map. Let's see if I can find it.
It's the last one.
All right. So look at here. There's Egypt. Where's Libya? To the west.
To the west.
Where's Cush? The Cushites.
To the
southeast. So the Libyans and the Cushites are west and south of Egypt, right? Well, this is pretty cool to me because it wasn't always that these areas were under Roman Empire, under the control of the Roman Emperor.
Mm-hmm.
When were they under the Roman Empire's control? Well, I'll tell you. Let's go back to my PowerPoint here.
Present.
The Libyans were annexed by Rome in 74 BC. The Cushites peacefully served under Rome's authority since 20 BC. So
it's a little bit after the late date, don't you think?
That's after the late date. Yes, that is. Very, very good observation there, Shane. So, Daniel, he gets it right. Some of these countries were not under Roman rule. Some of these countries that he's mentioning were. How could he get all this exactly right like that? Very pretty specific details. So the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. In other words, they're under his authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now let's get to verse 45. The last verse of chapter 11.
And he shall pitch his palladial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him.
All right, I've highlighted here in red because there's another way we can translate this. But we'll get to that in a second. Let's look at the first part. And he shall pitch his palladial or palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Well, what's the glorious holy mountain? I think we know.
It sounds really close to like glorious land, so I'm going to assume it's Jerusalem.
This
Mount Moriah or Mount Zion.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, Daniel uses this exact language in Daniel chapter 9 when he's talking about Jerusalem. So, yeah, this is Jerusalem. And he shall pitch his palatial tents, or the tents of his palace. This is pretty cool. Okay, Vespasian is he's where right now? He's in Alexandria, Egypt.
And
Well,
he's the son of Vespasian. I don't think
yes,
we mentioned that.
yes, Titus is the son of Vespasian, who, by the way, was declared Caesar at the same time as Vespasian, which is kind of cool. Josephus documents that as well. So we have two Roman kings here, Vespasian and Titus. Vespasian is technically the Roman emperor. Titus is the Roman general, second in command. So Vespasian sends Titus along with Tiberius Julius Alexander, the ruler of Egypt, to go besiege Jerusalem. Why? Because Vespasian is he has just now been declared emperor, and
He's got to go back to his capital.
Yeah, let me exit out of this for a second. I want to show you something kind of neat. Let me see. I think it's on josephus.org. Yeah. All right. So he was declared emperor in December of 69. So this is kind of what he does here. We know that Nero was assassinated, and this was the year of the four emperors, 68 through 69. Mm-hmm. We talked about that in Daniel chapter 7. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius and Vespasian are the four Roman generals after the death of Nero. After Nero's death, he either was assassinated or he committed suicide. Either way, Nero's dead. And
supposedly.
His four generals. So basically, his four generals are going to fight with each other over who's going to be Roman emperor. Galba is the first one. Otho takes Galba out, and then Vitellius takes out Otho, I believe, and then Vespasian is going to basically take out Vitellius. And so Vespasian and Titus, they win the power struggle over who's going to take control over the Roman Empire. So that's kind of what happened. That's what's going on. That's why Vespasian has to go back to where? Rome. He's assuming the control over the Roman Empire. So he sends who to Jerusalem to take care of the problem?
His son, Titus.
His son Titus. Yeah. So let me go back to my PowerPoint. You go to present. All right, so so his son Titus, acting on his behalf, he's going to establish two encampments. These these are at Mount Scopus and Mount Olives. So these are the palatial tents. He's going to surround Jerusalem with these two encampments at Jerusalem. That's documented by Josephus there. Okay. The sea, what do you think the sea is referring to there?
Probably, I would say the Mediterranean.
Yeah, Mediterranean and or the Dead Sea. Yeah, and if you go to the map, I can show you the map and you can kind of see that. I don't think that's, well, that's the wrong map. But yeah, here we go. There's the Dead Sea and there's the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. So Mediterranean, Dead Sea. Where's Jerusalem?
Yeah.
So there's Judea and Jerusalem. Okay, so there's those two seas. So it's referring to either one of those or to both. Let's go back to my PowerPoint. All right, so the sea is the Mediterranean or the Dead Sea. Notice this says here, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. They understand, okay, the ESV thinks that Vespasian, the king of the north, is going to come to his end. But is that really the topic that we've just been discussing? No. So this is a better translation of it. And he, the king of the north, will invade until its end, and there will not be anyone who helps it. that is the holy mountain or Jerusalem. The
You
word
might,
come, yeah, I can show you the
yeah,
Hebrew.
go to Perry. Kind of, I bet he talks about this, doesn't he?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Well, I'm
Here.
just saying, I think that'd be a good idea to go to.
Yeah, he explains it better than I could because he's actually a Hebrew scholar. I'm not. So um, let me see if I can find verse 45. Here we go. Yeah. The Holy Mountains is a allusion to Daniel 9:16.
Mm-hmm.
So here it is. He says these Hebrew words here are normally these pronomial suffixes. He gives the Hebrew here. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I can't read this. But he says are usually understood as referring to the king of the north. The nearest masculine singular antecedent, however, is the construct chain, and that's what that's referring to there, the Hebrew, which is more likely the intended referent. The context strongly suggests that the enraged king of the north has come to desolate the holy mountain. So the end, which is anticipated by the near context, is that of the holy mountain, not that of the king of the north. Furthermore, the phrase "until its end" in 1145 suggests an allusion to the similar wording in Daniel 9:26 and its end.
Mm-hmm.
Jerusalem's end, will come with a flood. Notice the flood imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And until the end, in verse 40 of Daniel 11, will be war. Okay, so since this pronomial suffix in Daniel 9:26 refers to the city and sanctuary, so also should this pronomial suffix or these suffixes in 1145 refer to the holy mountain. In Daniel 12:6-7, the end of these wonders. We're going to get into that in just a second. Is going to just describe the time of the end there, the end of these wonders, um, corresponds to the complete shattering of the power of the holy people, so that the end in 1145 more probably refers to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple than merely the death of a king. The use of the noun for the end of apostate Israel in Jerusalem occurs elsewhere in Scripture, and he gives those Old Testament references there. Um, anyway, so I think he does a pretty good job of showing um, why that should be translated that way. And I would like to show, because I think it's kind of interesting. All right, in verse 45 here. So the King James says, he shall come to his end. Perry says it should be translated, yet he shall invade to its end. And he gets the word invade from this word come in Hebrew, which I'll pull up here from Strong's here. I think includes.
Which is bow.
On. Yeah, here we go. One of the possible translations is what?
There's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways it can be translated, but invade is certainly possible, and it certainly fits as he argued. Yet he shall invade, and that fits with the same. I think it's in verse 40, where it says, "And he shall enter into the countries." What's that Hebrew word for enter?
Bow.
Oh, the same Hebrew word which is translated come here.
Mm-hmm.
So he's going to. So basically, the idea of invading those countries, including Jerusalem, I think is the idea. So the king of the north, Vespasian, through his son Titus, and the king of the south, Tiberius Julius Alexander, is going to invade to the end of Jerusalem, to its end. That's the nearest, as Perry argues, that's the nearest antecedent would be the holy mountain. So he shall invade to its end, and none shall help it, Jerusalem. Okay, so that's how we get that translation. So he wasn't pulling that, out of nowhere. That's a legitimate translation of the Hebrew. Go back to my PowerPoint. Any questions so far, Shane? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm following along pretty well.
Okay, good. I'm just making sure that I haven't overlooked anything or that's making sense, because I know this is kind of complicated. And I am not a Hebrew scholar. I think you probably know a little bit more about the Hebrew than even I do. But Jason Thomas Perry, his article is in a peer-reviewed journal, which is kind of hard to access unless you're a Hebrew scholar yourself. So, so I'm going to defer to Perry on this translation. I take it as being acceptable based upon my knowledge of the Hebrew, which is limited, and so I'm going to defer to him there. To me, I think it fits the context the best. All right, so Jerusalem, including the self-exalted king, is going to meet its demise. And then we transition into Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 to me is a little bit easier. It's not as complex as Daniel 11. So,
and we want to tell the audience a good Bible study is that forget the chapter divisions.
Yes.
Those are man-made.
Yes, those are man-made. Chapter 12 should be a continuation of chapter 11. So, Shane, could you read the verse?
At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. There shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book.
All right, so what is this phrase "at that time" referring to? The time of the
end,
which started to be talked about in verse 35, right? The end of verse 35. That transitioned to this time of the end. So we're still talking about the time of the end, which includes the destruction of Jerusalem from AD 67 to 70, as we've just showed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So who is Michael?
He is the archangel.
The archangel. And of course, in chapter 10, we know that angels are working behind the scenes in the kingdoms of men. And so Michael apparently plays a role in helping the faithful Jews escape the destruction of Jerusalem. And so it says there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. Where have we seen this phrase before?
That's language is very similar to what Jesus used according to the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yes, in Matthew 24. So Jesus apparently quotes Daniel there. So that gives us some indication that at least...
You want to pull up that verse, show people?
Yeah.
I guess.
Let's see. It's in Matthew 24. So
Matthew 24, I think. Well,
let's see here. Let me get into the ESV version here so I can read it.
Yeah. Well, 21. No. Where's that?
Yep. Here it is. For there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be. So that appears to be a reference to what?
Daniel 12.
Yeah. And just as a side note, the book of Revelation also talks about this tribulation, which I think is the destruction of Jerusalem as well. That's a whole nother podcast. We'll get into that later.
Yep. Stop there.
Yeah. Let's go back to... Yeah, here we go. So this is the destruction of Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, it says, but at that time your people shall be delivered. So here's a question for you. Is this deliverance a physical deliverance from the destruction of Jerusalem? Is it a spiritual deliverance, or is it perhaps both? I kind of take it as a physical deliverance here. We know that, but it could be both. It could be both, especially considering verse 2, as we shall see. Plus, it says, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. What kind of language is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's
Judgment Day language there. So Although it could just be talking about the judgment against Jerusalem, which is the context. So um, it could be physical deliverance, spiritual deliverance, or both. I I think it could be. I think it refers to both because Eusebius says that the church got out of Dodge basically. They left Jerusalem before it was destroyed, and of course also spiritually, as long as they were in Christ, we're
Mm-hmm.
we're always delivered from whatever our circumstances are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's go to the next verse here, verse 2. Go ahead and read that one.
Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall wake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever.
Where have we seen this language of stars shining before?
I think we saw it in chapter Daniel 8, didn't we?
Yep.
Stars
Yep.
being
Yeah, and
overthrown.
so we take this to be the faith of God's faithful, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
wise are God's faithful. We also saw it in chapter 11 in connection with the Maccabean revolt.
Mm-hmm.
And so we still have the faithful Jews who at this time would be Jewish Christians. They're described as being wise. They're going to shine like the brightness of the sky, and they're going to turn many to righteousness. Sounds like the apostles preaching the gospel, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to shine like the stars forever and ever. So, so my question is: is this occurring during the time of the end or after? Well, the stars forever and ever. Part of this has to be after because the time of the
Mm-hmm.
end is only it's a limited period of time. So it seems
Mm-hmm.
to me, at the very least, part of this has to be applied after the time of the end.
Mm-hmm.
So I interpret verse 2 as occurring afterwards. And so verse 1, the deliverance will occur during the time of the end, the physical deliverance. And then because he's talking about, judgment day imagery, he also says that they will also be spiritually delivered at the second coming. Basically, is what I believe. Some argue here that this language is talking about. Of course, what language is this talking about here?
Many of those who sleep
Yeah,
um,
which is what?
in the dust of the earth. And just to let everyone know, I think there's actually a good dissertation done by, well, what's his name?
I
Well,
got
it's from the Boyce Library, dissertations of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
you. Yeah,
And this guy did a really good job on Daniel 12, verse 2, and showing the theological connections of it throughout the Old Testament. That, this is not the first time that the theological subject of resurrection of the dead has come up. It's actually found much, much earlier in the Old Testament. It's really, really interesting. And I think for another podcast, we ought to talk about this because this
yeah,
is very important when it comes to sadly with some, well, even not just brethren but some out there in the denominational world who believe in this 80-70 doctrine of thinking that the resurrection has already come to pass at 80-70, and they're going to use these verses for their justification and twist them.
yes. And I
So
would like to point out that there are some people who do not take the 80-70 doctrine who do not interpret this as being the second coming of Christ there.
mm-hmm.
But I agree with you. I think the best interpretation is that it's referring to the second coming. Um, if we go to Ezekiel 37, we have a reference to a resurrection. We can go there. I can make a reference to it real quick to show where people get the idea that this is not talking about the second coming.
Mm-hmm.
They'll quote verses like this. Ezekiel 37. Um,
Talking about the
the va-
dry bones.
yeah, the valley of dry bones. I'm not going to read that whole chapter, but basically, he says, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And I answered, "O Lord God, you know." And then he said to me, "Prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord," and so on. And so
Mm-hmm.
basically, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. So there is a sense in which resurrection can be used to talk about like spiritual restoration. And so this here is talking probably about the restoration of the
Of
Jews in
Israel coming out of
Israel
Babylon.
become. Well, and it also has messianic implications because it makes
Mm-hmm.
reference to David,
Right.
the
Talking
messianic
about the
David. Yeah.
sticks coming together and
Um,
the northern and southern kingdom joining together
joining
and
together. So there's a
spiritual
reference.
kingdom.
Yeah, so there's a reference here to the Messianic kingdom, the restoration basically of Israel and becoming the Messianic kingdom eventually and being
Mm-hmm.
ruled by the Messiah. And
Right.
so there is some basis for the idea of resurrection being a spiritual resurrection. And let's go to John chapter 5.
Yeah, that's one of the main. Well, I'll mention Genesis 3. Where God said to Adam after he sinned,
Yeah.
you're now going to return to the dust, and that has something to do because he would certainly die, and he did, um, for the consequence of his actions. So that language kind of has to do with that. But I more so with this John 5:28-29. Do not
Yeah.
marvel at this, for the hour is coming who are in the tombs will hear his voice. Go down a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to start with verse
Oh,
25
okay. Oh, okay, go.
to
Yeah, go
show
ahead.
you that in one passage you have both a spiritual resurrection and the
Hmm.
literal resurrection at the end of time mentioned
Right.
here. So you can read verse 25 there for me if you want to.
Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he
So
has
that's
given,
talking, yeah.
yeah.
So that's
Okay.
talking about basically if you obey the gospel, the new birth, you have new life, you're a new
Hmm.
creation. So there's a sense in which you're resurrected from the spiritual dead.
That's right.
But then keep on reading there in verse 27 there.
And he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Do not see there.
Oh,
There's to
sorry.
execute judgment,
Yes.
which Jesus will judge on the last day, and John talks about the last day quite a bit.
Yes.
So do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation or judgment.
So I would point out that the spiritual resurrection does not apply to evil people. It applies to people who have obeyed the gospel.
Hmm.
But the resurrection connected with the judgment applies to both the good and the bad, as John says here, as Jesus says here, because both the good and the bad will be raised to be judged. So the question is, which type of resurrection fits better with Daniel 12? And so let me go back to my PowerPoint. Do we just have the good people being raised?
No, got the
No.
wicked.
So you got the wicked. So I think this shows that this is not talking about the spiritual resurrection, but it's talking about the literal bodily resurrection
Hmm.
at the end of time.
and
Um,
and and you see 80, 70 people really don't know what to do with that the resurrection of the wicked
yeah.
bodies, because in Matthew 10,
Hmm.
go ahead and go to that verse, Matthew
Okay.
10, I think verse 28. Sorry, we're having to bring this up, but just in case anyone want to accuse us falsely of
Well,
being,
this is important because
yeah,
we need to know if this is referring to the literal resurrection at the end of time,
right.
then if this occurs during the time of the end, then when would the resurrection have to occur?
Hmm.
By
And
70 AD.
so
But if it
Jesus,
occurs after the
okay.
time of the end, then it doesn't have to be referring to the 70 AD.
Hmm. And do
So
not
that's
fear.
important.
Oh, go.
Yes. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
sorry.
Yeah.
And do not fear those who kill the body. Definitely not talking about the church there, but
Yeah.
cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who can destroy both body, soul, and body in hell.
Exactly.
So somehow, I mean, there is an underlying thing going on here that the body has to be raised from the dead.
Yes. Because it's going to
And
be destroyed in hell if you're an evil person.
mhm.
Yes. So,
See, the 80,
that's,
70 people have to say when you die now, you go straight to heaven or hell. But um,
and the body here, there's just no way the body can refer to the church in this context. That's not exegesis. That's exegesis. Anyway, let's go back to my PowerPoint. I think, unless you got something else you want to say.
no, that's good.
Okay, so the question is, does this resurrection occur during the time of the end or after? And I think Daniel chapter 7 can help us because there's some interesting connections in this chapter with Daniel chapter 7. So I'm going to pull up Daniel chapter 7 here. At the end of this prophecy, we have the little horn making war with the saints, and he prevailed over them. And then it says, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. Okay, so when did the judgment occur? Was it during the war or after? It says the horn made war and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given. And then notice, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Notice the judgment imagery here. We also saw the imagery of the books were open, I think, back earlier in this chapter. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Talking about the fourth beast.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Yeah, see, the court sat in judgment, and the books were opened.
Mm-hmm.
So we have, this is the same kind of language used in Daniel chapter 12, talking about judgment against the fourth beast. Well, the Roman Empire didn't end in 70 AD. When did the Roman Empire end?
476.
Yeah, it had to have been after 70 AD, after
Mm-hmm.
the time of the end that Daniel's talking about in Daniel 12.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and also if you keep on reading in this prophecy, you have reference to in verse 25, he shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand. In other words, the Jewish Christians, the Jewish saints, shall be given into his hand for how long?
Times and half a time. 3.5 years.
3.5 years. So that's the time of the end.
Mm-hmm.
But then notice, but the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away. So after this period of time, after the time of the end, God's going to judge the little horn and the Roman Empire. And notice it says to be consumed and destroyed to the end. Well, pagan Rome was judged physically after the destruction of Jerusalem. And pagan Rome, and individually, every pagan Roman is going to be judged, including Vespasian and Titus, are going to be judged when? At the resurrection, right? Notice it says to be consumed and destroyed to the end. So this end here is not the time of the end. This is talking about after the time of the end. This is talking about what? The second coming.
Mm-hmm.
Because Daniel says, what's going to happen? The everlasting kingdom, all dominions shall serve and obey him. All dominions, not just the Roman Empire, but all. When's that going to occur? Philippians 2, every knee shall bow. So at the second coming, ultimately, every dominion will serve. But the prophecy here is dealing with the Roman Empire. And so the Roman Empire and the little horn, they're going to rule for a limited period of time. God's going to remove them. And they will ultimately be judged at the end of time, at the second coming. And that, of course, is after the time of the end. So I think we have good reason to believe that if we go back to chapter 12, let me go back to my PowerPoint.
And when we get to chapter 12, verse 13 as well, when we get there.
Yes, when we get there. And so,
we'll wait.
And so we know in verse 1, the time of the end, at that time is the time of the end. This is the destruction of Jerusalem, 67 to 70, the 3.5 years. They'll be delivered physically during that time. Spiritually, many of those who sleep. Well, Daniel's talking about the Jews here. So the Gentiles are not under consideration. Daniel wasn't written to Gentiles. It was written to thy people. Remember in Daniel chapter 9?
Well, the
It was,
Hebrew,
it was
especially.
written to the Hebrew Christians here. So the many of those who sleep is referring here to the Hebrew people, the Jews,
Mhm.
both the good, the Christians, and the bad, John Agasala and everybody else, Josephus, etc. So his focus, I think, is upon the Jewish people. So many of those who sleep, they're going to be raised at the end of time. So the Gentiles are not contemplated. John chapter 5 gets the Gentiles,
Mhm.
but in Daniel 12, that's not really the focus of Daniel. Daniel is focusing upon the Jews, the faithful and the unfaithful Jews. So that's
Mhm.
why that I take the many here. That's why it seems that the many is a part of the entire dead people there. He's talking about the Jews, both faithful and unfaithful. So the faithful
Mhm.
Jewish Christians are going to be raised and will shine like the brightness forever. That includes through the second coming and into eternity. But the evil people, they're going to have everlasting contempt. All right, that's after the time of the end that we just talked about. All right.
All right.
All right, so it's getting easier now, a little, at least for a little while anyway. Um,
But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase.
all right, so he's saying to shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end, until the 67 through 70 period, right? What's interesting is in Revelation 22, I'll go ahead and pull that up. Here's kind of a rabbit chasing here. We're not going to get into Revelation, but I think it's important to at least note it here. In 22:10, what does John say here,
He
Shane?
said, he said to me, "Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near."
So in Daniel, he's told to do what?
Seal
Seal it up.
up.
But here he
Do
says,
not seal up.
do not. So it seems to me that whatever was going to happen in Revelation, at the very least, it was going to begin very soon. Maybe not every detail in Revelation, was near, but at the very least, the bulk of the prophecies, it seems to me, were about to occur.
But in Daniel, the hundreds of years would pass.
Yeah, and I
So.
believe Revelation is the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy there in chapter
Mm-hmm.
12 and in chapter 7 and in chapter 9 and in chapter 11 verses 36
There's
through
a
40.
lot of allusions to Daniel in Revelation.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, let me go back to my PowerPoint here. All right, so Daniel's told to shut it up, shut up the words and seal the book because it's going to be a far away. The time of the end was not contemporary. It was with Daniel, nor was it contemporary with Antiochus, but it was actually contemporary with the Roman Empire in 67 through 70. So the prophecy about the time of the end was well into the future, and the Jews would seek to know more about the prophecy. And as the prophecy began to be fulfilled, the Jews would actually make reference to this. Daniel's actually predicting that the Jews they're going to make reference back to Daniel. And knowledge shall increase as it's being fulfilled, which is what happened because Josephus, when he was captured by Vespasian,
Mm-hmm.
Josephus interprets the Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man prophecy about the Messiah,
Mm-hmm.
and he predicts that Vespasian is going to be the next ruler over the Roman Empire before Vespasian became the next ruler over the Roman Empire. And so that's actually why Vespasian didn't basically kill Josephus. He actually freed him. And Josephus became like best friends with Titus
Mm-hmm.
because of that, because they were like, wow. So they thought, Vespasian and Titus thought Daniel predicted their rise, interestingly enough. Which, if you go back to chapter 7 in Daniel, which is kind of cool, I think, anyway. If you go back to Daniel 7, what do we know about the little horn who's the 11th Roman king? He's Titus. He destroys Jerusalem, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does Daniel say about him? He thinks that he's going to change the times and the law, right? Remember that passage? Let's
Mm-hmm.
see. Verse 25. He's going to think to change the times and the law. Where have we seen that phrase before? Daniel chapter 2. Who only can change the times and the law?
God.
Yeah, in Daniel's prayer, let me see if I can find it. Um, yeah, God changes what?
Times and
Times,
seasons.
seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Vespasian basically said, I'm the Messiah, I'm God. And Josephus actually identified him as that. Save his skin, basically. Excuse me. But back to chapter 12 here. So yeah, the Jews, they would seek to know more about the prophecy, and as it began to be fulfilled, their knowledge about the prophecy would increase. All right, then we have this passage here, verses 5, 6, and 7. Go ahead, Shane.
The night Daniel looked, and behold, two others stood, one on the bank, this bank of the stream, and one on that bank of the stream. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, How long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished.
All right, so we have the end of these wonders. That's the 3.5 years, time times half a time. Where did we see that before? Daniel.
3.5. Yeah, episode 25.
And what does Daniel 7:25 say? Let's go back to it, just to make sure
I think
everybody's on the same page.
time, and half times. Time
Yep.
times.
Yeah, but notice what it says there about that. It says, and they, who's the they? The
The
saints
saints,
of
the
the Most
Most High,
High. They shall be what? Given
into his
into his
hand
hand.
for a
Whose hand?
time.
The little horn, right? For the three and a
Mm-hmm.
half years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so um, the so who are the saints then in chapter 12?
Jews.
Let me pull up my.
The holy people.
The shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end. So during the 3.5 year war, the Jewish Christians had to get out of Jerusalem, right? They
Mm-hmm.
lost their property, they lost their temple, their entire culture just got annihilated. So we might say that they were kind of shattered. But was this a part of God's plan?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, in Daniel chapter 9, right? So here we have a transition from the old covenant temple, the old covenant Jerusalem, to the new covenant temple, the new covenant Jerusalem. So um, after the destruction of Jerusalem, the church is going to be forever separated from Judaism. And even the Romans treated Christians differently than Jews. And so Christianity will become a separate religion from Judaism for sure at this point. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a good point to note here.
And some people
Yeah.
might be confused by holy people. Holy people doesn't necessarily mean righteous. It just means set apart. In which that's what we find in Deuteronomy, I think chapter 7,
Yeah.
where God said to Israel, He says, "You are a holy people that you're going to be set apart from all the other nations," and they were. Um, so
Yes.
I just think that's
Yes.
something that needs to be
Yeah,
brought
it's
out.
possible that the holy people here could be inclusive of both the good and bad Jews. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Either way, I think it still fits. The Jewish Christians, if you take holy people to just be the Jewish Christians, um, well, their whole entire culture was just annihilated. Their temple was
Mm-hmm.
destroyed.
Yeah.
Their property was lost,
Mm-hmm.
um, which their land, Jerusalem, was just devastated. And so that would be parallel to our Washington, D.C. and White House and Capitol building being decimated. Even though I have no religious connection to those, I would take offense at that, and it would certainly be persecution to me. So um, same idea here, I think, for the Jewish Christians, and it will only last for 3.5 years. And then all these things, the end of these wonders, the 3.5 years, the time of the end would be finished. Okay? Verse 8.
I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, yeah, I could see that. Then I said, "Oh my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" Here he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up, sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and shall be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But those who are wise shall understand."
All right, so it seems the end of these things, I think he's wanting to know what's going to happen after the time of the end. And that's the way the ASV translates it. What's the outcome of these things? So it could be a reference to basically what's going to happen at the time of the end, or it could be what's going to happen afterwards. I take it afterwards because what does he say in verse 10?
Many shall purify themselves.
Well, I guess it could still be the time of the end here.
Yeah, wicked shall act wickedly. That's like kind of the language of Revelation. Let the filthy be filthy still, and let the righteous be righteous still.
This could be referring what's going to happen at the end of the time of the end, basically. The destruction of Jerusalem. So basically he's saying, well, what's going to happen when Jerusalem's destroyed? Basically, I think is what he's saying. He's like, I don't understand what's going to happen. Which I'm thinking, in Daniel chapter 9, Gabriel tells Daniel what's going to happen there to Jerusalem. It's going to be destroyed. And he's like, how can it be destroyed when the Messiah is going to come and he's going to anoint the most holy? How does that make sense? So I can understand why Daniel does not really understand. And basically, the angels here are saying what? Daniel, you're just going to have to wait.
and I think it's interesting. God, he wants them to focus on how to live out their life in a righteous manner.
Yeah, stay faithful. That's what matters. Purify yourself, and don't worry. Let God handle it. Basically, is what God's telling Daniel. Let God handle it. Just be wise and stay on God's side. God's got this. It's basically, I think, what the angel is telling Daniel.
Yeah.
Even if you don't understand how this can be, God's got it. Don't worry.
Yeah.
All right.
Trust him.
Yes, trust him. All right. Well, now we're at the end of the book. Yeah. Last 2 verses.
Here we go. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days.
All right, so this is how. Well, we actually technically there's one more verse. I'm sorry. We're almost to the end. We're almost to the end of the time of the end here. So, all right. It says from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up. Well, the time in context is talking about what? The time of the end. So it seems to me that the time here is probably talking about that. So we're getting a chronology here about the time of the end. Now, it was already described as time times half a time, which is 3.5 years. 1,290 days and 1,335 days is about 3.5 years. Interestingly enough, in the Jewish calendar, if I remember correctly, if you add, let's see, what is 3.5 years? How many days is that? I think it's in Revelation that actually identifies it. Is it 1,260 or 1,240? Let me look. Let me go back to, I think it was on another slide. Yeah, Revelation chapter 11, verse 2, I think makes reference to it. Uh, 42 months or 1,260 days. You see that in 2 and 3?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that this is talking about the time times halftime because of what's said, I think, in chapter 13, I believe. Let's see. Or is it 12? I think it's 12. They have 1,260 days. In verse 14, what's that called? Time.
Times and half a time.
Half a time, an allusion to Daniel. So, at least in the book of Revelation, he interprets this phrase "time times half a time" as 1,260 days. What's interesting in Daniel, though, which I think is kind of cool, is Daniel doesn't say 1,260 days. What does he say? 1,200.
1290 days.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if the Jews, the way they calculated time, their months were 30 days. So 30 times 12, I think, is what, 360 days. So there's normally what, 365 and 1/4 days in a year. So what did the Jews have?
Our modern day calendar.
Yeah. Anyways. So, but to keep up with the seasons, what did the Jews have to do about every 3 years? Every 3 or 4 years, they would add another 30 days to another 30 days, another month to their calendar. Okay. Which would make it how many days? 1,260 plus 30 is
not 1,290.
So, which is still considered 3.5 years, which is kind of funny to me. Anyway, so 1,290 is consistent with the time times half time.
Go to the next slide. I think you're. I don't know if you meant to be on that side or that.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be here. Yeah, 1,290 days. So 1,260, 1,290 are both consistent with the time times half time, or 3.5 years. Both are consistent with the way the Jews describe 3.5 years. And so from the time that so basically the angel is giving Daniel a little bit more specificity here. In other words, he's saying it's not just 1,260, it's actually 1,290 to 1,200 or to 1,335. So that shows you how specific the angel's getting here with this time of the end. So from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up. In other words, the beginning of the abomination of desolation, right? What do we know about the abomination of desolation in the destruction of Jerusalem?
Well, Jesus refers to it, and
yes. Let's go ahead and turn to Matthew 24. Jesus is going to clarify Daniel. It's amazing to me how Daniel and the book of Revelation and Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, how they clarify each other. When you let the Bible explain itself, it's just remarkable.
Can't be best commentary. Best own commentary.
Yes, let God explain Himself. So, I think in Matthew 24 verse 15, I believe, Jesus says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken by who?
By the prophet Daniel.
By the prophet Daniel. So where is it standing?
In the holy place.
What was Jerusalem called?
The holy city.
The holy city, the holy place. And then he says, let the reader understand. So in other words, he's saying, hey, go read Daniel for yourself. You already got this in the book of Daniel. It's basically what he's saying. What does he say? Let those who are in Judea
flee to the mountains.
Flee to the mountains. Okay. In Luke's account, which is really cool to me, Luke 21, Luke explains what the abomination of desolation is. In verse 21.
Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside.
I'm sorry. Verse 20. Verse 20.
But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation has come near.
Then let those who are in Judea, what?
Flee to the mountains.
So Matthew 24:15, talking about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, is identical to what? When you see Jerusalem
surrounded by armies.
Surrounded by armies. The Roman armies, they had pagan symbols on them, right? That's why it's called the abomination of desolation. It was an abomination. They were standing in the holy place, and they were about to do what?
Destroy Jerusalem.
Destroy Jerusalem. This occurred in around November 17th, AD 66. This guy, Cestius Gallus, was the governor of Syria, and Nero told him to suppress the Jewish rebellion. And so this is the beginning of when the Roman Jewish War basically began. So the Jews were rebelling. Nero sends Cestius Gallus to suppress it. What happens? Well, let's read what happens. We're going to look this up. Excuse me. this, and let's go to
Livius.
Livius.org. This guy here is not a Christian, for sure. He believes in the late date of Daniel, by the way. He actually has an article on Daniel chapter 11, and he believes it was written late. So he is not a biased fundamentalist
He's a
Christian.
hostile witness.
He is a hostile witness, yes. So, but this is how he dates things. All right, so here we have 66 AD. So all this right here is the Jewish rebellion. In these black areas here, November 16th to November 25th, it's talking about the Fulminata attacks. That's talking about Cestius Gallus. Notice here he says the preferred dates are in bold, so we might as well say it's around this time period here. And I think on Josephus.org, he says it's like November 17th, which I think is kind of neat.
That's pretty close.
So I think that's pretty close, right? I think that's pretty accurate. So we know that on the 16th, Cestius Gallus and his the Fulminata, the legion there in Syria, it attacks Jerusalem, or it starts to attack Jerusalem. It actually surrounds Jerusalem. I believe, let's see if he mentions it here. You know what? It might be on Josephus.org. Let me see if I can pull it up here. All right, the campaign of Cestius Gallus. So we have October through November of 66, okay? And he doesn't use AD, he uses the CE, so he's probably not a Christian.
Common era.
Common era.
Common to who? I mean, that's what I'm kind of wondering.
Yeah. So here he describes Cestius's military errors. So here we have the Fulminata or whatever. Let's see. Yeah, so the Roman historians on the defeat of Cestius Gallus. This is kind of cool. So Tacitus says that Cestius Gallus, he was in charge of Syria. He attempted to crush the Jewish rebellion. He had to fight several battles, generally with what?
Ill success.
Ill success. Cestius dying either in the course of nature or from vexation. I thought it was kind of funny. He's upset because he couldn't conquer the Jews there. Let's see. The endurance of the Jews lasted till Florus was procurator. In his time, the war broke out. So Cestius Gallus, who was the legate of Syria, who attempted to crush it, had to fight several battles, generally with ill success. Cestius dying either in the course of nature or from vexation. So Cestius is not successful. Let's see. I'm wanting to say he surrounds it, though. He surrounds Jerusalem. Let me see if I can pull it up here.
Yeah, but show that map real quick. I mean,
here it is. Here it is.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll show the map here in a second. See here, he says November 17th.
Cestius advances on Jerusalem. He sets fire to suburban districts and moves to the wall of the upper city, pitches camp in the vicinity of the royal palace.
Okay.
And then the principal pro-Roman men of Jerusalem invite Cestius into the city, but he delays. The rebels attack the pro-peace faction, murder their leaders, then bombard the Romans from the wall. After 5 days, the Romans, heavily shielded, are on the verge of undermining the wall and setting fire to the gates of the temple. Cestius suddenly gives up and retreats from the city without any reason in the world.
That's what Josephus says. Yeah. Notice what Josephus says here. It was, I suppose, owing to the aversion God had already toward the city and the sanctuary that he delayed from putting an end to the war that very day. So, here I would argue, even Josephus says basically, this is kind of the beginning of the abomination of desolation. This is when, on November 17th, Cestius advances on Jerusalem and he's surrounding the city. So during this time period, I think November 17th is a pretty good reasonable start here. Because Jesus says what? When you see
See the army surrounding Jerusalem.
surrounding Jerusalem. So I'm going to start it at November 17th based upon what Jesus says. But based upon what Daniel says, I think it's reasonable. This whole time period, you could start it anywhere from here. It's kind of like the 2300 evenings and mornings with Antiochus. There's lots of different spots where you could begin and end that time period, but it covers the basic time period of when Antiochus persecuted the Jews in Daniel chapter 8. And I think the 1290 to 1335 covers the time period pretty accurately from November to August, November of 66 to August of 80-70. The 3.5 years there, the time times halftime, the time of the end. I think that's pretty consistent with the chronology that we know. Considering that Daniel was writing 500 years before, it's actually absolutely remarkable.
But I mean, isn't this amazing? I mean, he had the city, in his hand,
Yeah.
and he didn't take it. I mean, it's
If he
kind
had,
of
think about this, if he had destroyed it here, what Daniel wrote in 1136 through 12 through the end of 45 would not have been fulfilled. Think about that.
Yeah. And so, this ain't like what happened to Sennacherib, with 180 with an angel coming down and destroying 185,000 Assyrians. This is, he just retreats.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
It's interesting. And even Josephus says he retreated without any reason in the world. Maybe God had something to do with it because God's in control. And God says, you know what? I already wrote what's going to happen in Daniel 11:36 through 45. And so I need that to happen because that's what I want to happen. And so God, for whatever reason, is in control and knows what's going to happen. He knows the end from the beginning, as Isaiah says. So at any rate, I take November 17th to be a good starting place. That's when Cestius surrounds Jerusalem, but he backs off, giving the Christians time to do what?
To
Get out of
escape.
Dodge. To get out of Dodge, to escape Jerusalem. As Jesus said, flee to the mountains, which is where?
And toward Pella.
Towards Pella, right where? There.
Yeah.
North of Jerusalem. That's where, according to Eusebius, the church historian, the church in Jerusalem went up here. We don't know about the church in Judea or in some of these other areas. It's possible that these other Christians might have been slaughtered by Vespasian. We don't know. All we know from Eusebius is that the church in Judea, the church in Jerusalem went here. Okay? Alrighty. Let's see. And it's possible that Eusebius that might not be accurate. I take it as accurate. I don't see any reason why Eusebius. I think Eusebius and Epiphanius, there's two church fathers who say that's what happened. So I see no reason to doubt it. It makes sense. So Jesus told him to do it. And Josephus says many Jews actually left Jerusalem at this time. Josephus actually says that, I believe. Let me see if it's mentioned by Josephus here. Yeah. Josephus says, after this catastrophe had befallen Cestius, many of the distinguished Jews abandoned the city like what?
Swimmers from a sinking ship.
Swimmers from a sinking ship. So here Josephus documents the fact that many Jews escaped at this point in time. Eusebius says that that's when the Jewish Christians escaped. So I see no reason to doubt Eusebius' what he says happened there. All right, so whether it happened or not, it doesn't matter. But it's possible that Jesus said, hey, you need to flee to the mountains. It's possible that they just ignored Jesus. Jesus didn't say that you had to follow what I say. He just told them you need to flee to the mountains. And at this time, and this was the perfect time to do what? Get out of Dodge. And Josephus says that it was. Many Jewish Christians, or many Jews left Jerusalem, which could very well included the Jewish Christians. Okay. Let's go back. So we have November 17th here is when I think the 1290 days begins, because that's when Jerusalem was surrounded. So we can say, oops. PowerPoint.
There it is.
There it is. Let's open this puppy up. All right, so notice the beginning point. The burnt offering, the regular burnt offering is taken away. That's the daily sacrifice. It's taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up. Okay? So when did that? We know that this is referring to when Jerusalem was surrounded by Roman armies. That was in November 17th, 66. But what does this regular burnt offering thing have to do with? I'm going to compare this to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. I think Daniel 9 helps us to understand what Daniel's talking about here in chapter 12. Let's take a look at that. And I'm going to go to the King James translation because I think it's a better translation of Daniel 9, 24 through 27. All right. What two events happen that's in connection with the 70-week prophecy?
We got the crucifixion of Jesus and destruction of Jerusalem.
Yes. So in verse 26, can you read that for me?
And after 62 weeks. I'm thinking of Abraham Lincoln.
I know, that's exactly what I was thinking of too. That's a score. Score is 20 years. Yeah. So 3 score would be
that'd be 60 and 2 weeks.
Yeah, 62 weeks. 62 weeks of years.
Shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself? And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with the flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined.
All right, so we have 2 key events here. The Messiah will be cut off, which, by the way, I'm going to go ahead and I think it's interesting to note to be reminded of this. The word cut off there, where's that?
Karat.
Karat. It means to destroy or consume, but notice specifically to do what?
To make a covenant.
To make a covenant. So it's to die a violent death and to enact a covenant, which fits with what the Messiah does in verse 27. What does he do? He shall confirm
a covenant.
Covenant with the many, the Jews, for
with many for 1 week.
That's the 70th week, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to go over this entire prophecy again, but
just watch the other episode.
Yeah, watch the other episode. So Jesus is going to die a violent death and enact a new covenant, and then what says the people of the prince, that is the people of Jesus. Who are the people of Jesus? The Jews, right? Or it could be Jesus sending the Romans.
Yeah,
or it could be that the prince who's to come could be Titus. There's some ambiguity there. I take the people of the prince to refer to the Jewish people. The prince who is to come is referring back, in my opinion, to the Messiah. Okay. And so his people, the Jews, actually, they instigated the war. And in the temple, they actually started to burn down the temple before the Romans did, believe it or not. So the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and sanctuary. Whether that's the Jewish people or the Romans is immaterial. Both played a role in destroying Jerusalem. Destroy the city and sanctuary. And the end thereof shall be with the flood. We already talked about the flood imagery of Vespasian. And so Vespasian sends Titus to destroy Jerusalem. Its end with the flood. The time of the end. Unto the end of the war. Desolations are determined. And then, so we have 2 key events here. What's going to happen? Read verse 27.
And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And
so who's going to remove the daily sacrifice, the regular burnt offering?
Jesus. Well, Jesus is.
It's 30 AD in the midst of the 70th week. He's going to cause the sacrifice to cease. What happened to the temple curtain when he died?
Torn in two.
Torn in two, and of course the book of Hebrews says what about Old Testament sacrifices?
They've been done away with. Well, they've been
Yeah,
fulfilled.
they've been fulfilled. They've been done away. The old covenant's no more. So old
Mhm.
covenant's no more. Old covenant sacrifices have ceased, theologically speaking.
Mhm.
Historically, though, when are they destroyed?
And destruction of Jerusalem.
Destruction of Jerusalem. So we have Jesus ending the sacrifices theologically first, and then those sacrifices end historically in 70 AD, because those sacrifices theologically were meaningless to God. He had already ended them when Jesus died on the cross. Okay? So what comes first? Jesus' death, the removal of the daily sacrifice, and then we have the setting up of the abomination of desolation. So let's go back
Mhm.
to chapter 12 on my PowerPoint here. So I think what Daniel's doing here, or what the angel is doing here, is the the removal of the daily sacrifice, the old covenant sacrifices, and the setting up of the abomination of desolation, the destruction of Jerusalem, the beginning of that, the beginning of the war. I think he's pairing these two together, because when Jesus died, the temple curtain was torn in two, symbolizing and foreshadowing what?
The destruction of Jerusalem.
Destruction of Jerusalem. And so I think the angel is pairing these two together to start the chronology, which begins when Cestius Gallus surrounds Jerusalem, November 17th, AD 66. If you add 1,290 days to this date, if I remember correctly, let's go back to, oops, let me go back here. I'm going to have to come out of my PowerPoint, sorry. We go back to josephus.org. If we scroll down, well, this is the campaign of Cestius Gallus. If you go to the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, if you add 1,290 days to November 17th, 66, if you add 1,290 days, guess what it's in the middle of? the
What Daniel
siege,
said.
the siege of and destruction of Jerusalem. Let's go down here to the date. If I remember correctly, 1,290 days takes us to. By the way, here's a picture of it. You've got the third wall, the second wall, and the first wall, and here's the temple complex, okay? John of Giscala, the self-exalted king, and he's the king of the Zealots. Okay, he's one of the Jewish factions that's fighting for control over Jerusalem. He's the Jewish king that we talked about in the last chapter. Okay, so that's where he's at there. Titus is he's surrounded Jerusalem the second time. This time he's going to desolate it. 1,290 days later, Titus is surrounding Jerusalem. He's going to breach the third wall, the second wall. When does he breach the second wall? Let's see here. He breaches it at what date?
May 30th.
May 30th, 70 AD. So Jerusalem's second wall is breached 5 days after the third wall. Titus he picks up troops recklessly. He enters the city, but then he's kind of pushed back. So we kind of have almost like a pause in the war right here. So the second wall is raised, and so from this time period, this is kind of neat to me.
Well, I think it's interesting. He didn't want to destroy the temple at first,
Yeah, well, that's what Josephus said. I mean, we don't know exactly.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
there's some things that Josephus says that you might take with a grain of salt because he's biased at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But Vespasian is not going to lie about the details, like May 30th. Why would he lie about that?
Mm-hmm.
So I can see that Josephus trying to paint Vespasian in the best light possible. But I see no reason why Josephus is lying about the dates here.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so from May 30th, what happens after May 30th? We have a pause in the siege. In early June, the Romans begin building earthen banks at two locations. Josephus is actually appealing to the rebels to surrender, because now remember he's siding with Vespasian and Titus now, which is kind of funny. Josephus is the best friend of Titus. Josephus saved his own skin, so they don't like Josephus. The Jews don't like Josephus. So Josephus is trying to get the people to surrender. And then notice this. Horrific famine seizes Jerusalem. Remember, this is kind of neat. Although Josephus says, with his tears, thus loudly appealed to them, the insurgents, they did not yield. In other words, John and Giscala and the other people, they
swallowed their gold and silver. Gross.
Yes.
And then the Romans found out about it, and they would open up their stomachs.
They opened up their stomachs. So there was this horrific famine, because John had already, I think they burned the grain supply that was in Jerusalem. And then notice here, mass what?
Crucifixions.
Crucifixions. We often think of Jesus as being crucified. Crucifixion was not an extraordinary method of death. There were many people who were crucified during the Roman Empire. What makes the crucifixion of Jesus extraordinary was, of course, his resurrection, and of course the darkness over the land, and the temple, the earthquake, and the temple veil being split in two. But Titus here, he crucifies Jews that were surrendering. Notice, how many?
500 a day. And what's interesting is, Josephus sees three of his friends on crosses, and he asks for them to come down, and two of them died still, but one was restored. But he would have died if he had stayed on that cross. So we only have one survival in history of crucifixion, only because
of Josephus.
Because Josephus.
Yeah, because he was cut down or whatever. And of course, if someone's going to argue that Jesus did not die by crucifixion, well, what kind of body did the apostles say he had? A glorified body. If they saw a desolated body, or a desecrated body, or a body
that need medical attention,
they would have said, "Man, you're not the resurrected Messiah. You need some medical attention." So that explanation of the resurrection doesn't hold a hill of beans. Doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Anyway, so we have mass crucifixions between May 30th, and if we add 1335, I believe was the date. Let me go back here to make sure. Yeah, here it is right here. If you add it, 1335, to our November 17th, 66, what date does that take us to? July 14th, 87. What happens in July 14th? Well, let's go back to Livius, because he actually highlights this in red. And what does he say? The red stuff is what? Certain dates. What happens on July 14th, AD 70?
It's end of daily sacrifice.
Yeah, John of Giscala, that's when he plundered the utensils connected to the sacrifice. You remember that? So, if I remember correctly, let me see if I can pull it up here. I think it's... Let me go back up this way. Yeah. We know it was July 14th because... the siege of Jerusalem. Here's what Livius.org has to say on what? On 14. Well, no, that's April. Let's go to July. Here it is. On July 14th, prisoners told who? Prisoners told the Romans that the priests in the temple had been forced to interrupt the daily sacrifices. Okay, so this testimony came from prisoners that were taken prisoner by the Romans. So that's why we're pretty certain that's the date. So, what's interesting is if we go from November, oops, wrong one. Sorry about that. So if we add 1,335 days to November 17th, we actually come to. I actually did this calculation out. We actually come to July 14th, AD 70, which was when John saw stop the daily sacrifice, marking the end historically of Old Covenant Israel. So, and notice what Daniel says here. He says, "Blessed is he who waits and arrives at what?
1335.
What goes on between 1290 and 1335? We just talked about that.
So
Mass
famine.
crucifixions,
Famine.
and so on.
Yeah.
So that makes sense why Daniel is saying here, look, if you can make it through this 45 days, then you're blessed. You're blessed, man. Basically. So if we pair together the regular burnt offering being done away and the Romans circling Jerusalem, setting it up, and if you add a 1,335 days, that takes us to when John actually ends the daily sacrifice historically. Another way you can look at it is that Daniel is describing the removal of the burnt offering here on July 14th and the setting up of the desolation of the abomination of desolation. He's describing it in reverse order. Why would he describe it in reverse order? Because Jesus does what first?
He dies.
He dies.
And takes away the burnt offerings.
Yeah, so we don't know exactly. Either the removal of the burnt offering is referring to Jesus, and it's just being paired together with, the setting up of the abomination of desolation, or Daniel is simply talking about the actual removing of the regular burnt offering in 70 AD in reverse order because of that very thing. I don't know. I'll let you decide which. I tend to think that the removal of the daily sacrifice, to keep it consistent with what Daniel says in Daniel 9:27, I think it's being paired together as the beginning of the chronology. But either interpretation, I think, makes sense of the chronology. So on July 14th, AD 70, John Gaskell, he stops the daily sacrifice, marking the end historically of Old Covenant Israel. Okay. Any questions about that verse?
Mm-mm.
Okay. And
the last verse.
The last verse. We've done it, Shane. I think we've done it. So we've got this last verse. Why don't you go ahead and read the last verse for me?
Go your way till the end, and you shall rest, which is what we're going to do after we get done with it. You shall rest, and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days.
All right, so basically, what the angel is telling Daniel is, go your way till the time of the end, right? Which is interesting to me because at the very beginning of this whole section, this whole prophecy, what about the wise in the Maccabean revolt?
Mm-hmm.
What does it say there? It says, some of the wise shall stumble, and so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. So, they're going to die before the time of the end takes place. Well, guess what? So is what?
Daniel.
But just because you die, does that mean that's the end of you?
Nope.
No, you're going to be in the waiting place of the dead, and that's where the faithful Jews in the Maccabean revolt were when the time of the end happened, right? Mm-hmm. And that's also where Daniel is. Go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. In other words, Daniel, you're going to be alive in the Hadean realm. You're going to be alive spiritually. You're not going to be alive physically, but you're going to be alive spiritually in the Hadean realm. And God, this basically.
Certainly an allusion there to resurrection shall stay. I mean, the rest, I agree with the Hades, but shall stand.
You
most
shall
likely.
rest and shall stand. So that could be a reference, like you said, to the resurrection that was just made in Daniel 12:2 and 3.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good point. Um, I don't know if I made that point here, but now that you mention it, I think you're right. The resting there means that Daniel's going to be dead during the time of the end, but he shall stand in his allotted place at the end of the days. I guess the end of the days there would be the second coming.
Mm-hmm.
So the time of the end, Daniel's going to rest, but he will be resurrected at the end of the days, just like everybody else. Death is not the end for Daniel. He joins the wise who live on despite death, even to the time of the end. And of course, he is resurrected at the end of the days, at the second coming. That's the way the book ends. And so that's pretty much how I take it. I think for those of you who are interested in this kind of stuff, I would encourage you to go to Jason Thomas Perry's article.
Why don't you
Here's
give them the title of that article?
Here is the article. Um,
Desolation of the Temple and Messianic Enthronement.
yeah, let me go to the very beginning of the article. You can Google this. I've actually downloaded it to my computer. It should be on the internet. If you can't Google it and find it, you can also email me and I can send you a copy of it because I've downloaded it to my computer. So here's the article. It's from JETS, the Journal of Evangelical and Theological
Theological
Society, I think.
Society. Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
this is a peer-reviewed
And I think probably
journal.
by now that they probably have that issue available for free.
Yeah, if you're able to access it, but I think you can Google it. I believe that's where I pulled it up on Google.
Mm-hmm.
But it's Jason Thomas Perry, Desolation of the Temple and Messianic Enthronement. I don't agree with everything he says about chapters 12, verses 1 through 3. And there's a couple places, even in the prophecy, where I'm not in entire agreement with him on it. But overall, I think, in my opinion, I can't argue with his treatment of this very difficult prophecy. I think he really has done a fantastic job. And at least to me, his interpretation fits the known historical facts, and it makes sense of Daniel 11:36 through 45, which gives even conservative Bible scholars difficulty. So I commend this article for your perusal if you are interested in studying about this more. I think he really did a good job, and he convinced me after reading the article. He convinced me overall. He convinced me with his treatment of it. So it's a good article. But that is the end of Daniel 11:36 through the end of the book, chapters 12, verse 13. I actually went further than what Jason Thomas Perry goes through. So that is the end of this amazing prophecy. Shane, is there any comments or questions that you have about it that maybe I haven't addressed?
Probably what we should. One of the things that I think is interesting for us, I think it's amazing that Josephus, what his writings were preserved, and you kind of wonder if the reason they were preserved, because there's a lot of historical material that we don't have. Like I think it was like Nicholas of Damascus. We don't have any of his 120 books that were written on world history, if I remember correctly, something like that.
Yes.
And that's really sad, But here we have Josephus, and we
also
have
Tacitus. It's not just Josephus. We also have Tacitus and Suetonius who
yeah.
talk about some of it too.
So they help shed light on that Daniel's prophecies were historically fulfilled, and I think that's really interesting.
These historians, Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius, were not biased Christians who are just making up fulfillment. In fact, Josephus, like I said, he believed Vespasian was the Messiah, so he didn't even believe Jesus was the Messiah. And so I think he's a hostile witness and yet
Mm-hmm.
his documentation fits with Daniel's prophecy, and fits with the Christian interpretation of the prophecy. And to me, this prophecy is just as amazing as the rest of the prophecy in chapter 11. When you
Yeah.
and what's amazing is, verse 36 through 45. If you interpret it the way that I just did, even with a late date, that predates the prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't get around the fact that Daniel is a true prophet of God. You go to chapter 7, the prophecies about the Roman Empire in chapter 7, in chapter 9, and in chapter 11, 36 through the rest of the book. To me, even with a late date, you still can't get around it to me.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel is truly a prophet of God, even if you date it late.
And as Daniel says, his head hurt after well, our heads hurt too.
Yes.
But overall, look at what we studied, and I find it once again. I've gone through this book now 3 times, and I find it fascinating every time, and deepens my faith.
What
Um,
was it? The end of chapter 7. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart.
yeah.
And then in chapter, what was it? He says the same
Um,
thing basically. I think maybe in chapter 8.
chapter 10, I think,
Yeah, chapter 10. That's right.
verse 1. Yeah. Well, he's mourning for 3. Well,
Maybe it's at the end.
uh,
Yeah. He fell on his face. He had trembling hands and knees. Yeah, didn't he say somewhere that his head was hurting? I think.
yeah, something. Yeah. I can't. I
Well,
don't
anyway,
know.
I think we've done enough tonight.
So
But
probably in our next videos, we might want to try to deal with some objections that have been made, if possible. So we might do that.
yeah, yeah, about whether it could be Antiochus, and and there's actually other interpretations.
Well, I'm talking about like, well, like dealing with, like we could look at Jonathan's article, talking
Daniel
about
12:2,
the
the resurrection.
arguments, well, the arguments for and against the early date and late date. Um,
Yeah, yeah, definitely. We do need to do. I think we need to do another video on the date of Daniel, um, because I think, didn't you say there's some other videos that you want to look at by atheists, and we want to answer their arguments. We want to give them a fair hearing. So
mhm.
um, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, Jonathan McClatchy. I have an article by him, and I think he did a pretty good job of giving both sides of the date, early and late date arguments.
Mhm.
And I think it's a pretty good study. That even if you give the other side a fair hearing, I think the evidence, I think, leans toward the early date.
Well, we appreciate everyone being with us. And
Yes, it's been a long
it's
podcast,
2 hours and 30 minutes long, so we're gonna
so
stop here. And we appreciate being with y'all. We're gonna sign out. Thank y'all for sticking
thanks
with us.
everybody. Thanks, Shane. I enjoyed it, buddy.